Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 1 discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about the Legacy of Phrecia event. This is something that I'm at least calling patch 3.25.5. It's not going to be the scope of a full league, but it is going to be something where Grinding Gear Games are pulling out some of their tested ideas, things that they ended up scrapping, but things that they think could still be fun to play around with. And one of the main features is it's going to have 19 new Ascendancies. You are not going to be able to play the core 19, you are going to be forced to pick one of the new 19. Today, we're going to be talking about the Gambler Ascendancy. This is a duelist Ascendancy, and it's themed primarily around luck. There's a number of things that are important to know about this Ascendancy. Firstly, let's talk double and triple damage. This will come up when we look at growing Accumulator, but it's important to state here that double damage percentage chance, triple damage percentage chance, these don't stack in the best possible way, they stack in a different way. Firstly, you roll to see if you earn triple damage on the roll. Then, if you fail that roll, you roll to see if you get double damage. You can't simultaneously get triple and double damage on the same roll for hexuple damage or even quadruple damage. No, if you roll both triple and double, you're only going to get triple damage on that hit. Additionally, there are other sources of triple damage and double damage that exist in the game. They won't stack very well with this. And secondly, there's a lot of things in this Ascendancy that talk about being lucky and unlucky. This has a precise definition in PathOfExile 1. Firstly, if you are lucky, you roll twice and you take the more favorable roll. If you are unlucky, you roll twice and you take the less favorable roll. And if you are simultaneously lucky and unlucky, you don't do both. So it's not like you roll 3 times, discard the top, discard the bottom, and take the median roll. No, instead, you roll only once. The lucky and the unlucky cancel out. That's important because if it did go with the median, there'd be a lot more clustering on the middle, but instead, it is just the full spectrum of results that would normally happen otherwise. Finally, monster elemental resistances being inverted means that if a monster has plus 16% cold resistance, then it's going to be treated as minus 16%, and if it's got minus 16%, it's going to be treated as plus 16%. Ultimately, this is a really strong node, but we'll get to that later. Let's start with risk aversion, and we're going to work in a counterclockwise direction around this Ascendancy. So risk aversion has 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments. This is a stat that has an enormous power jump from 99% to 100%. When you're at 99%, you can still occasionally get shocked by an enemy hit, and that can be really, really unpleasant. Particularly worse, though, you can also get frozen. It's not going to happen very often, but when it does, you're not likely to recognize it, and as a result, you're likely to go splat. 99% to 100% already has a fair bit when it comes to monster hits. But the big change, though, is with shocked ground and chilled ground. When you are at 99% chance to avoid elemental ailments, you are fully affected by shocked ground and chilled ground. When you're 100%, you are completely and utterly immune. So if you elect a spec risk aversion, you are definitely going to want to find ways to get this up to 100% via other means. Now, probably the best of these is going to be the unique dual Ancestral Vision. This is extremely strong. It has a text modifiers to chance to suppress spell damage, also applied a chance to avoid elemental ailments at 50% of their value. So if you can get your character up to 100% chance to suppress spell damage, then Ancestral Vision is going to grant you a bonus 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments. Well, 50% plus 50% is the magic 100%, so that's where you want to be. This is a really good option, but Ancestral Vision is quite a rare unique. It will be available, but do count on it being something that costs a little bit. Additionally, there's a number of unique items. Elevore is one I'll call to your attention because there's going to be another use for this later. This has 20 to 25% chance to avoid elemental ailments, and it's so common that you'll be able to get 25%. There's Crystal Skin on the passive tree, which has 20%, and there's a number of mods you can roll on rare items that will give you even more of this stat. But also, there's another unique ring that you might want to use on some builds, not on very many, but certainly on some, where you get this as a bonus for free. Do not use Astral Projector just for the 30% chance to avoid elemental ailments that's on it, but if you already want this item because the rest of your build is based around it, Astral Projector is going to give you a bunch of this stat for free, and Risk Aversion could complete that package. 50% chance to avoid being stunned is another thing you're really going to want to find ways to push that up to 100%. If you can, then Risk Aversion is going to feel like a medium to solid node, but if you can't get them up to 100%, I would say Risk Aversion is a pretty poor node. All in all, I feel like this is one of the most skippable nodes on the Ascendancy. It does a medium amount, but if you can find a way to replace it with a node that does a big amount, then of course you're going to do that. Next, we want to talk growing Accumulator. So let's start with the maths on this. Firstly, you have a 15% chance to deal triple damage. Triple damage is plus 200% damage, so this is 30% more damage than you would otherwise do, assuming you've got no other sources of triple damage or double damage on your character. Then if you fail that roll, you have a 30% chance to deal double damage. So this is a 25.5% chance to deal double damage, which means that the total bonuses on this are 55.5% more damage. But then we have this awful deal 25% less damage. All in all, this is 16.625% more damage if you're playing a build that has no other sources of triple damage or double damage on it at all. However, if you have other sources of triple damage, and let's go with the extreme example, shall we? Let's go with Paradoxica. Paradoxica has a text, attacks with this weapon deal double damage. So if you've got this, then your baseline damage before growing Accumulator is double damage, so 200%. With growing Accumulator, it goes up to 215% because 15% of the time your double damage gets upgraded to triple damage, but then you've got this 25% less damage. You don't need to do the numbers to see that this is going to be a terrible deal overall. Essentially what we're saying here is that growing Accumulator is a solid enough node. It adds about 1/6 of your damage, assuming that you've got no other sources of triple damage, no other sources of double damage. But it really rapidly falls off the more of these stats you've got. And if you take it to the extreme level, this will end up being a net negative node for you. After that, this leads to Spectacular Parlay. Now this has two particular lines of text on it. Here we need to talk about the numbers of damage with hits is unlucky or damage with hits is lucky. For all of this, let's assume that you're using a weapon that deals between 50 and 200 damage. Those of you with a calculus background will quickly recognize that the average amount of damage you're going to deal is 125. It is the exact middle, but if you've got unlucky applied, that actually gets nerfed down to 100. If you've got lucky applied, that gets buffed up to 150. Those of you less familiar with calculus can probably work out the 125, but might struggle a little bit with the calculations on why it's 100, why it's 150. Here's the simple version though. If you're not lucky or unlucky, take the average of the minimum and the maximum. If you are lucky, then take the average of the minimum, the maximum, and the maximum again. If you're unlucky, take the average of the minimum, and the maximum. That is going to be your average damage in all of those situations. Spectacular Parlay has the text, your critical strike chance is lucky. Now this is a fairly hard stat to get these days, and it's at its best if your critical strike chance without it would be very close to 50%. If you're at 50% without it, this will push it up to 75%. If you're at 40% without it, this is going to push it up to 64%, which is an increase of 24%. If you're at 60% without it, this is going to push it up to 84%, another increase of 24% in absolute terms. So the closer you are to that 50%, the more impactful this is going to be. On the flip side, if you're at 10% without it, this is only going to push you up to 19%, and so it's only going to affect 9% of your strikes. That's definitely not going to be worth. Damage with hits is unlucky. There are three interactions I want to call out that might make this particular notable worth your while considering. Firstly, there is the Winds of Fate. This is the rarest of the Sanctum items that is not named Original Sin. It's also something that generally isn't all that popular. Sandstorm Visage, everyone pretty much wants that, but it is much more common than Winds of Fate. Fair warning, you should not lightly plan a build that's going to use the Winds of Fate, because if a lot of other people are doing so, you might find this item is pretty hard to acquire. But it has a monumental amount of physical damage that it deals, but it has a number of really weird mechanics when it's used as an attack weapon. Firstly, a huge amount of crit multi. That's really good because this is going to be a crit weapon. Then 75% of your physical damage is converted to a random element, cold, lightning, or fire, and 25% of your physical is converted to chaos. So you're full converting away from physical, but it's in a weird, difficult to optimize way, where 25% is going to be chaos and 75% is going to be one of the three elements, but you're not sure which. Then you've got the real killers on this, because so far, everything about this item looks absolutely sublime. But then we have the text, maximum critical strike chance is 50%, and non-critical strikes deal no damage. This ultimately kills off the item for normal use. However, if you are determined to try and use it, you can get that maximum critical strike chance to a de facto 75% by also being lucky. There are other ways to attempt to use this weapon. They're all pretty niche, but this is definitely one that you could play around with if you're interested. Also, I want to point out a couple of things that aren't affected very much by damage with hits is unlucky. Firstly, we have Bloodthirst Support. Bloodthirst Support adds a massive amount of flat physical damage to your attacks with weapons. This is added to both the minimum and the maximum damage simultaneously, and it's an equal amount that's added to both. This simply means that it is less affected than most other things by the fact that your damage is unlucky. All the damage that's added by Bloodthirst Support doesn't care that you're unlucky. And exactly the same principle applies to Sacrifice Support, but this time we're talking about spells instead. So this is something that causes your supported spells to sacrifice 20% of your current life. Not your maximum life, but the current amount of life that you've got when you cast them. And they gain an amount of chaos damage equal to 44% of the amount of life that you sacrificed when Sacrifice Support is at level 20. And in reality, you'd probably push it a little bit higher than level 20 as well. So you might be looking at 45% or more of the amount of life points that you sacrificed. So if you've got 10,000 life on your character, which there are a number of ways to get, and you use Sacrifice Support to sacrifice 2,000 of that life, you're going to gain 900 flat damage. That's a lot, but it's also 900 to both the minimum and the maximum damage. And so that's something that can be very effective if you're playing certain types of builds. Not every build is interested in this, but there are going to be a small number that are. That's some of the things I've thought of that can mitigate this drawback. All in all though, Critical Strike Chance is Lucky is a very powerful effect, but it's not something that everyone wants. Most of the time, people try to find ways to push their critical strike chance all the way up to 100%, rather than relying upon something that's RNG based, like Critical Strike Chance is Lucky. The vast majority of builds aren't interested in Spectacular Parlay, but there will be a small number that are. From the things that are niche role players to the things that I think will be very widely used on this Ascendancy, we have Heads and Tails. This is an option that you can choose between. There are two different choices you can make. You can either bias your block chance to favor spell damage through Heads, but then at the expense of your chance to block attack damage being unlucky, or you can go with Tails and have your chance to block spell damage be unlucky and your chance to block attack damage be lucky. So let's start with the one that I thought of first when I was looking at this, and that was to use Saffell's Frame, which gives you a fair chunk of spell block. You'd also use this in conjunction with Tempest Shield, which gives you even more spell block, and maybe 1 or 2 clusters on the tree. When you've got this, you could then get your spell block chance to be 75%, and then also get it to be lucky. After that, you then use Evasion as your primary defense against attacks. This is something that could work, but I don't think it's necessarily as strong as the other option, which is something that other people brought to my attention. Remember we were talking about Elevore before. 20 to 25% chance to suppress spell damage, recover 100 to 200 life whenever you suppress spell damage. Well, let's build a character that runs Elevore and 100% spell suppression. So, if you take a 2000 damage hit from a spell, and let's say that that's 2000 after it punches through all of your resistances, you're going to suppress it. Because you're suppressed spec, this is going to bring it down to a little bit under 1000 damage, and you're going to regain almost 200 of that life back straight away. So this ends up being a reasonably solid defensive layer against spells. You'll still need to have at least 75 to all your elemental resistances, ideally more than that, but it's a good starting point. Then on top of that though, that's your defense against spells. Your defense against attacks is based around a shield and tails. Your chance to block attack damage is lucky. You are completely treating spell block as a dump stat here, so the drawback on tails doesn't apply to you at all. You could potentially get 75% chance to block attack damage, and then also have lucky on that as well, for a total of 93.75% chance to block attack damage. Okay, so we're blocking attacks really reliably, we're gaining some life back when we suppress a spell, but what else can we do? Well, we can gain a chunk of life back when we block. There is the Surrender, which is an Ulnatol unique shield. There is also a similar but slightly weaker mod that you can get on Shaper Influence shields. Of course, the Shaper Influence shields may end up being the better package overall, and you can certainly consider those on your build. Both of these are going to be options. Either the Surrender, 500 life on block, or alternately, using the Shaper shield, maybe only gaining back 300 life when you block, but at the same time having a bunch of other mods that might be powerful on your character as well. Bunch of different options there, but ultimately this appears to be the strongest way to build defensively around the Gambler Ascendancy. Spec Tails, disregard spell block entirely, build for suppression, use Elevore, use the Surrender or a Shaper Influence shield, and laugh off a lot of damage except for the very, very biggest hits, which are either going to suppress or at least have 93.75% chance to completely block. Now, I'm willing to wager that some of you are comparing Heads and Tails to More Than Skill from the Gladiator Ascendancy. Now, obviously, More Than Skill is not going to exist in 3.25.5. so it's not like it's a completely fair comparison. But that said, I actually think that the heads and tails options can be better than More Than Skill. More Than Skill has this really awkward rider on it that is, it's only lucky if you've blocked recently. Now, when you're mapping, the uptime on that is pretty high, but that is not the case when you're fighting bosses. Quite often, More Than Skill is down, and then suddenly the boss lands a hit on you, and the first time it lands a hit on you, you just roll unlucky, and you end up not blocking it, and then the second hit can finish you off. Now, if you're 75-75 block chance, this is only going to happen 1 in 16 times, but if you're 65-65 block chance, which is much more common than 75-75, this actually can happen about 1 time in 8, and so that ends up being meaningfully worse. If you have either of the heads or tails setups that we were discussing there, then you're going to be in a much better position against something along those lines than you would be with More Than Skill. That said, More Than Skill, once you get rolling in a map, this thing is absolutely phenomenal because it applies simultaneously to both attack and spell block, and so it doesn't mean that you need to find a different solution for the other type of damage. Basically, different strengths, different weaknesses, but I think they're reasonably comparable in overall power. Leading up to this is a 4-point node, whether you decide to go with heads or tails. Leading up to this is overly confident. And I'm going to say, this sounds really good, but it just isn't. Damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky while you are on low life. So, let's assess this as though it does not have the rider that you need to be on low life. You can easily be on low life if you want to be, through the use of Petrified Blood or other options. So let's assume that you've got that solved, and let's assess how good this would be if it said damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky. Remember what we said about when you're unlucky, you're averaging the bottom twice plus the top once. That's the amount of damage that you're going to take on average. Most enemies deal 80% to 120% of their baseline damage. So the average when they're not lucky and not unlucky is 100%. The average when they're unlucky is actually only nerfed down to 93.33%. So you can think of this as 1/15 less damage from monsters, which is not something that you would be happy to take as an entire Ascendancy notable in any circumstances. And on top of that, it also has the additional rider that you need to be on low life. So think of this as a tax node. It does something. It's not a lot, but it does something. But the reason that you take it is because chance to block attack damage is lucky is so unbelievably strong. Or in another situation, you might find that spell block being lucky is so incredibly strong that you decide you're willing to pay the price of having a 2-pointer that does almost nothing. Okay, so that's the weakest node on the Ascendancy out of the way. Let's go to the final arm here, Risky Exploit. Risky Exploit goes with a stat that you can get more of on the unique shield Kiloava's Bluster. Now, this is a shield that has certainly not been lighting the world on fire in PathOfExile 1. However, does have an interesting line of text, 30 to 40% chance for elemental resistances to count as being 90% against enemy hits. Notice first the weakness. This only applies against hits. This does not apply against damage over time. This means that in certain circumstances, this is really bad. The things that will kill you in certain fights, for example, Uber Shaper. Uber Shaper, if you stuff up any of those balls, the cold balls that explode on the ground and put them in a terrible location, Kiloava's Bluster is not going to provide you with any mitigation against those. Ditto the Uber Maven balls, and particularly the Cortex and Uber Cortex encounters. There is a lot of damage over time on the ground that is elemental. You would love to have 90% resistance against them, but you're not going to get 90% resistance because Kiloava's Bluster doesn't apply. Now that's the exact same stat that Risky Exploit has, except that Risky Exploit has a little bit more of this stat than you're going to get on Kiloava's Bluster. The key thing though is that the two stack together pretty well. If you're willing to go with both Kiloava's Bluster and also Risky Exploit, you're going to end up with potentially 90% chance to have your elemental resistances count as 90% against enemy hits. This is actually pretty good. And the thing that I think this really helps you solve is the downside on Replica Loreweave. This is an item almost no one uses because that text at the bottom, your maximum resistances are 70 to 72%, is pretty overwhelming. The thing is, the rest of the stats on this item are really good. It adds a huge amount of global critical strike chance, 3 power charges worth. It's got a whole chunk of extra energy shield, a whole chunk of life, a whole chunk of mana, a bunch of other welcome stats on it. The stats are generally really good, but that maximum resistance's drawback is big. However, if that only applies to some of the hits you're taking, it starts to be a little bit less painful because most of the time, either Kiloava's Bluster or the Gambler Ascendancy is going to kick in and you're going to count as having 90% even though your maximum resist is actually 71. You're still going to count as being at 90% when that comes into play. So that's Risky Exploit. It also is important to note that this has a drawback on it as well, minus 25% to all elemental resistances. This is something that's a pain to deal with. Early on, you're probably going to want to use Purity of Elements to deal with this, and that's going to solve it for you. Later in progression, it's just going to be an affix tax on your gear, and an affix tax that is real. This is not something that is a trivial thing to fix. It's going to mean that the rest of your gear is going to be weaker overall. All that said though, Risky Exploit, it's not always going to work, but when it does work, it's going to be really strong. I don't think that this is a node I'm happy to take for 2 points, but given how powerful a node behind it is, I'm okay with it as a tax node. And then we have Reversed Odds, arguably the best thing on the entire Ascendancy. This effectively allows you to completely ignore monster elemental resistances in most circumstances, not in all circumstances. This only applies to hits, not to damaging ailments. And we'll talk in a sec about the interactions between this Ascendancy and ailments in a second, both the damaging and the non-damaging ones. But with Reversed Odds, 50% chance to treat enemy monster elemental resistances as inverted means that if a monster has 20% cold resistance, then 50% of the time you're going to be hitting it at 20%, 50% you're going to be hitting it at negative 20%. If it has 60% cold resistance, 50% of the time you're going to be treating it as 60%, 50% of the time you're going to be treating it as negative 60%. Quick little mathematics quiz for you. What's the average of X and minus X? That's right, it's 0. Effectively, Reversed Odds, when you're playing an averages game, it averages to be monster elemental resistances are 0. This is extremely, extremely strong because it means you can completely disregard all of the resistance stripping effects that exist in the game. This is very similar to a node that exists on the Inquisitor Ascendancy in the normal game, and that is a really strong node. The Inquisitor one is tied to critical strikes. This is just tied to hits. Reversed Odds is going to be one of the things that's pulling you into using the Gambler Ascendancy on your character. However, there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of here, and this is where we start talking about the interactions between the spikiness of damage on this entire Ascendancy and ailments. Now, if you're inflicting shocks on enemies, you're going to find that Growing Accumulator and Reversed Odds actually make your shocks better on average. The reason for this is that you're going to get more spiky damage, higher highs, lower lows. The lower lows are going to inflict some baseline of shock on the enemy. That's going to be a little bit lower than your baseline would be normally. But then those higher highs are going to result in bigger shocks, and those shocks will endure because they will dominate over all of the small shocks that you inflict. Basically, spikier damage is good when it comes to inflicting shock, when it comes to inflicting chill. When it comes to inflicting freeze, there's not all that much difference, but when it comes to inflicting ignites, poisons, and bleeds, gotta say, this Ascendancy there is trash. Growing Accumulator for damaging ailments, the double damage, the triple damage doesn't work. The deal 25% less damage does work, and so you end up doing less damage because you expect those nodes. Reversed Odds, now this only applies to Ignite here. 50% chance to treat elemental resistances as inverted is only for hits. This does not apply to ignites that you might inflict. So essentially, this entire Ascendancy does basically nothing when it comes to inflicting ailments on enemies that deal damage. But non-damaging ailments is a slight improvement. We also need to talk about when monster elemental resistances get shot up into the stratosphere by various mechanics in game. Now, the most common of these is the map mod. There's a map mod that I think is 40% magnitude that increases elemental resistances on all monsters in a zone. Now, 40% is the default, but this can easily be increased through map modifier effect increases, and it can wind up that every monster in an entire zone starts out resist capped. Even if you're applying curses to debuff monster resistances, you can find that these maps can feel really, really tanky. And if the monsters also have endurance charges from another map mod or various other effects along those lines that also buff their resistances in other ways, you can wind up in a situation where even if against, say, Uber Maven, you have enough resist stripping to bring her resistances to the negatives, you might still find that every monster in the zone is still resistance capped. On top of that, there's a few things that are even more extreme. Eldritch Altars can push the resistances to fire and chaos if it's Searing Exarch, or Cold and Lightning if it is the Eater of Worlds influence, can push those resistances well over 150%. So even though in Path of Building, you might find that the curse approach of stripping enemy resistances, using effects like exposure and the like to lower the resistances that way, ends up giving better numbers. In the actual game, reversed odds may end up turning out to be better. That's definitely the feel if you've ever played an Inquisitor at endgame and taken advantage of that crit node. So this node is better than it's going to look in Path of Building, because weird circumstances come up when it comes to monsters getting enormous buffs, and this is particularly the case if you want to be farming 250% quantity tier 17 maps, where some monsters are going to have 180, 200% elemental resistances just out of the box. Additionally, who knows, you might even be able to find some really cunning combos that take reversed odds, but also take the stacking mastery in elemental masteries that does exactly the same thing, but just on a smaller numerical value of it, get a total of 75% chance to treat enemy monster elemental resistance values as inverted, and then that could put you in a really good spot. One last thing, because you're not required to use elemental resist stripping curses like elemental weakness or flammability on a setup like this in order to get damage, you can use a different curse instead. You might decide to use temporal chains, you might decide to use enfeeble. Enfeeble is really good for survivability, or alternately, if you want damage, there's always punishment. Punishment is weaker than an elemental resistance curse, but it does something useful. Whereas with reversed odds, and especially if you also take the elemental mastery, it's achieving nothing. So that's something else that you could consider there. All in all, I think the Gambler Ascendancy, there's a few interesting things you could do here involving Winds of Fate. There's a few objectively strong things involving Tails, Elevore, max spell suppression, and the Surrender, or a Shaper Shield. Or alternately, potentially you could go with the head setup that uses Saffell's Frame, but that is probably a little bit weaker. That was my first thought, but I think others have convinced me that the Tails option is better. And I think that the default setup you're going to want to go with this Ascendancy is going to be to take reversed odds and Tails. And if you've got a strong reason to deviate from that, you definitely can, but I think that that's going to be the stock standard Gambler Ascendancy. Anyways, that's all I got on this. May your Varlobs have interesting results, and I will see you around.